Hello everyone and welcome back to Heather Happy Stitches. Today we are doing part 3 of the Jack Skellington canvas. Now again, I'm going to do as much as I can. I'm not going to restrict it to a specific section. I'm just going to try and get as much done as I can. It looks like there's a lot of blocking in this section, so it's not going to be a lot of, it's not super confetti-full. So hopefully we can do it faster than we have been. And I've got my 4-placer. So let's get going. Oh, before I forget, this bouncy unicorn one, I didn't like it. It's too top heavy and it makes it hard to work. Like it wiggles too much. So I mean, I'll keep it as a pretty thing, but I'm not going to, I more than likely won't use it again. But it's pretty full though.
Story 12 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. A Fight with a Ghost by Q.E.D. No, I never believed much in ghosts, said the doctor, but I was always rather afraid of them. Have you ever seen one? Asked one of the other men. The doctor took his cigar out of his mouth and contemplated the ash for a moment or two before replying. I have had some rather startling experiences, he said, after a pause, during which the rest of us exchanged glances. For the doctor has seen many things, and is not averse to talking about them in congenial company. Would you care to hear about one of them? It gives me the cold shivers now to speak of it. We nodded, and the doctor, taking a sip as an antidote to the shivers, began. You remember George Carson, who played for the varsity some years ago, big chap with a light mustache? Well, I saw a good deal of him before he married, while he was reading for the bar in town. It was just after he became engaged to Miss Stoner, who is now Mrs. Carson, that he asked me to go down to a place which his people had taken in the country. Miss Stoner was to be there, and he wanted me to meet her. I could not go down for Christmas Day, as I had promised to be with my people. But as I had been working a bit too hard, and wanted a few days' rest, I decided to run down for a few days about the New Year. Woodcote was a pleasant enough place to look at. There were 2 packs of hounds within easy distance, and it was not far enough from the station to cut you off completely from the morning papers. The Carsons had been lucky, I thought, in coming across such a good house at such a moderate figure. For, as George told me, the owner had been obliged to go abroad for his health, and was anxious not to leave the place empty all the winter. It was an old house, with big gables and preposterous corners all over the place, and you couldn't walk 10 paces along any of the passages without tumbling up or down stairs. But it had been patched from time to time, and, among other improvements, a big billiard-room had been built out at the back. A country house in the winter without a billiard-room, when the frost stops hunting, is just, well, not even a gilded prison. The party was a small one. Besides George and his father and mother, there were only a couple of Mrs. Carson, who, being somewhere in the early teens, didn't count, and Miss Stoner, who, of course, counted a good deal, and lastly myself. Miss Stoner ought to have been happy, for George Carson, besides being an excellent fellow all around, was by no means a bad match, being an only son with considerable expectations. But somehow or other, she did not strike me as looking either very well or very happy. She gave me the impression of having something on her mind, which made her alternately nervous and listless. George, I fancied, noticed it, and was puzzled by it, for I caught him several times watching her with an anxious and inquiring look. But as I was not there as a doctor, of course it was no business of mine, though I discovered the reason before I left Woodcote. The second night after my arrival, we had been playing, I remember, a family pool. The rest had gone upstairs to bed. George and I adjourned to a sort of study, which he had arranged upstairs, for a final smoke and a chat before turning in. The study was next to his bedroom, and parted off from it by a curtain. As we were settling down I missed my pipe, and remembered that I had laid it down in the billiard-room. On principle I never smoke another man's pipe, so I lit a candle, the house being in darkness, and started away in search of my own. The house looked awfully weird by the flickering light of a solitary candle, and the stairs creaked in a particularly gruesome way behind me, just for all the world as though someone were following at my heels. I found my pipe where I had expected in the billiard-room, and came back in perhaps a little more hurry than was absolutely necessary, which perhaps explains why I stumbled in the uncertain light over a couple of unforeseen stairs and dropped my candle. Of course it went out, but after a little groping I found it. Having no matches with me, I was obliged to feel my way along the banisters, for it was so dark that I could not see my hand in front of me. And as I slowly advanced, sliding my hand along the broad balustrade at my side, it suddenly slid over something cold and clammy, which was not a balustrade at all. For stopping dead and closing my fingers round it for an instant, I felt that I was holding another hand, a skinny, bony hand, which writhed itself slowly from my grasp. And though I could hear nothing and see nothing, I was yet conscious that something was brushing past me and going up the stairs. "Hi, what's that? Who are you?" I called. There was no answer. I admit that I was in a regular funk. I must have shown it in my face. "What's the matter?" asked George as I blundered into his study. "Oh, nothing," I answered. "Dropped my candle and lost the way." "But who were you talking to?" "I was only swearing at the candle," I replied. "Oh, I thought perhaps you had seen somebody," replied George. Somehow I did not like to tell him the truth, for fear he would laugh at my nervousness. But I determined to keep an eye on my liver, and take a couple of weeks' complete rest. That night I woke up several times with the feeling of that confounded hand under my own, a clammy hand which writhed as my fingers closed upon it. The next morning after breakfast I was in the billiard-room practising strokes while Carson was over at the stables. Presently the door opened, and Miss Stoner looked in. "Come in," I said. "George will be back from the stables in a few minutes. Meanwhile we can 50 up." "I wanted to speak to you," she said. She was looking very tired and ill, and I began to think I should not have an uninterrupted holiday after all. "Do you believe in ghosts?" she asked, having closed the door and come up to the table, where she stood leaning with both her hands upon it. "No," I replied, missing an easy caroom as I remembered my experience of last night, "but I believe in fancy." "And, supposing then that a person fancied he saw things, is there any remedy?" "What do you mean, Miss Stoner?" I replied, looking at her in some surprise. "Do you mean that you fancy—" I stopped, for Miss Stoner turned away, sat down on one of the easy chairs by the wall, and burst into tears. "Oh, please help me," she sobbed. "I believe I'm going mad." I laid down my cue and went over to her. "Look here, Miss Stoner," I said, taking her hand, which was hot and feverish. "I am a doctor, and a friend of George. Now tell me all about it, and I'll do my best to set it right." She was in a more or less hysterical condition, and her words were freely punctuated by sobs. But gradually I managed to elicit from her that nearly every night since she came to Woodcote she had been awakened in some mysterious way, and had seen a horrible face looking at her from over the top of a screen which stood by the door of her bedroom. As soon as she moved the face disappeared, which convinced her that the apparition existed only in her imagination. That seemed to distress her even more than if she had believed it to be a genuine ghost, for she thought her brain was giving way. I told her that she was only suffering from a very common symptom of nervous disorder, as indeed it was, and promised to send a groom into the village to get a prescription made up for her. And, having made me promise to breathe no word to anyone on the subject, more especially to George, she went away relieved. Nevertheless, I was not quite certain that I had made a correct diagnosis of the case. You see, I had been rather upset myself not many hours before. George was longer than I expected at the stable, and I was just going to find him when at the door I met Mrs. Carson. "Can you spare me a moment?" she said, as I held open the door for her. "I wanted to find you alone." "Certainly, Mrs. Carson, with pleasure. An hour, if you wish," I replied. "It is so convenient, you know, to have a doctor in the house," she said, with a nervous laugh. "Now I want you to prescribe me a sleeping draught. My nerves are rather out of order, and I don't sleep as I should." "Ah," I said, "do you see faces and such like things when you wake?" "How do you know?" she asked quickly. "Oh, I inferred from the other symptoms. We doctors have to observe all kinds of little things." "Well, of course, I know it's only a fancy, but it is just as bad as if it were real. I assure you it is making me quite ill, and I didn't like to mention it to Mr. Carson or to George. They would think I was losing my head." I gave Mrs. Carson the same prescription as I had written for Miss Stoner, though by that time the conviction had grown upon me that there was something wrong which could not be cured by medicine. However, I decided to say nothing to George about the matter at present, for I could hardly utilize the confidence which had been placed in me by Miss Stoner and Mrs. Carson, and my own experience of the night before would scarcely have appeared convincing to him. But I determined that on the next day, which was Sunday, I would invent an excuse for staying at home from church and make some explorations in the house. There was obviously some mystery at work which wanted clearing up. We all sat up rather late that night. There seemed to be a general disinclination to go to bed. We stayed all together in the billiard room until nearly midnight, and then loitered about in the hall, talking in an aimless sort of fashion. But at last Mrs. Carson said good night, with a confidential nod to me, and Miss Stoner murmured, "So many thanks, I've got it," and they both went upstairs. George and I parted in the corridor above. Our rooms were opposite each other. I did not begin undressing at once, but sat down and tried to piece together some theory to account for the uncanniness of things. But the more I thought, the more perplexing it became. There was no doubt whatever that I had put my hand on something extremely alive and extremely unpleasant the night before. The bare recollection of it made me shudder. What living thing could possibly be creeping about the house in the dark? It was a man's hand, of that I was certain from the size of it. George Carson was out of the question, for he was in his room all the time. Nor was it likely that Mr. Carson Sr. would steal about his own house in his socks and refuse to answer when spoken to. The only other man in the house was an eminently respectable-looking butler, and his hand, as I had noted particularly when he poured out my wine at dinner, was plump and soft, whereas the mysterious hand on the balustrade was thin and bony. And then, what was the real explanation of the face which had appeared to the two ladies? Indigestion might have explained either singly. Extraordinary coincidents do sometimes occur, but it seemed too extraordinary that a couple of ladies, one old and one young, should suffer from the same indigestion in the same house, at the same time, and with the same symptoms. On the whole, I did not feel at all comfortable, and looked carefully in all the cupboards and recesses, as well as under the bed, before starting to undress. Then I went to the door, intending to lock it. Just as my hand was upon the key, I heard a soft step in the corridor outside, accompanied by a sound which was something between a sigh and a groan. Very faint, but quite unmistakable, and, under the circumstances, discomposing. It might, of course, be George. Anyhow, I decided to look and see. I turned the handle gently and opened the door. There was nothing to be seen in the corridor. But on the opposite side I could see a door open, and George's head peeping round the corner. "Hello," he said. "Hello," I replied. "Was that you walking up the passage?" he asked. "No," I answered. "I thought it might be you." "Then who the devil was it?" he said. "I'll swear I heard someone." There was silence for a few moments. I was wondering whether I had still better tell him of the fright I had already had, when he spoke again. "I say, just come in here for a bit, old fellow. I want to speak to you." I stepped across the passage, and we went together into the little study which adjoined his bedroom. "Look here," he said, poking up the fire, which was burning low. "Doesn't it strike you that there is something very odd about this house?" "You mean—" "Well, I wouldn't say anything about it to the master or Miss Stoner for fear of frightening them. All the same, scarcely a night passes but I hear curious footsteps on the stairs. You've heard them yourself, haven't you?" "Now you mention it," I said, "I confess I have." "And, what is more," he continued, "I was sitting here 2 nights ago half asleep, and it seems ridiculous, I know, but it's a fact. I suddenly saw a horrible face glaring at me from between those curtains behind you. It was gone in a moment, but I saw it as plainly as I see you." I moved my seat uneasily. "Did you look in your bedroom or in the passage?" I asked. "Yes, at once," he replied. "There was nothing to be seen. But twice again that night I heard footsteps passing. Good God!" He started up in his chair, staring straight over my shoulder. I turned quickly and saw the curtains which parted off the bedroom swing together. "What is it?" I asked breathlessly. "I saw it again! The same face, between the curtains!" I tore the curtains aside and rushed into the next room. It was empty. The lamp was burning upon a side table, and the door was open, just as George had left it. In the passage outside all was quiet. I came back into the study and found George running his fingers through his hair in perplexity. "There is clearly one person too many in the house," I said. "I think we ought to draw the place and find out who it is." "All right," he said, picking up the poker from the fireplace. "If it's anything made of flesh and blood this will be useful, and if not—" He stopped short, for at that instant the most awful shriek of horror rang through the house, a shriek of wild, uncontrollable terror, such as I had never heard before, and I never hope to hear again. One moment we stood staring at each other, dumbfounded. The next, George Carson had dashed out of the room and down the corridor to the stairs. I followed close behind him, for we both knew that none but a woman in mortal fear would shriek like that, and that that woman was Miss Stoner. Down the stairs we tumbled pell-mell in the darkness. But before I reached the landing below, where Miss Stoner's room was, I felt, as I had felt that evening before, something brush swiftly past me. As I ran I turned and caught at it in the dark, but my hand gripped only empty air. I was just about to turn back and follow it, when a cry from George arrested me, and, looking down, I saw him standing over the prostrate form of Miss Stoner. The door of her room was open, and by the moonlight which streamed into the room I could see her lying in her white night-dress across the threshold. What followed in the next few minutes I can scarcely recall with accuracy. The whole house was aroused by the poor girl's awful shriek. She was quite unconscious when we came upon her, but she revived more or less as soon as Mrs. Carson and one of the terrified servants had lifted her into bed again. Nothing intelligible could be gathered from her, however, as to the cause of her fright. She only repeated hysterically again and again, "Oh, the face! The face!" When I saw I could do her no further good for the present, I took George by the arm and led him out of the room. "Look here, George," I said, "we must find out the reason of this at once. I am certain I felt something go by me as I came downstairs. Now does that staircase lead anywhere but to our rooms?" George considered for a moment. "Yes," he replied, "there is a door at the end of the passage which leads up into a sort of lumber room." "Then we'll explore it," I said. "For my part I can't go to sleep until I've got to the bottom of this. Get the man to bring a lantern along." The butler looked as though he didn't half like the enterprise, and to tell the truth, no more did I. It was the uncanniest job I ever undertook. However, we started, the three of us. First of all we searched the rooms on the floor above, where George and I slept. Everything was just as we had left it. Then I pushed open the door at the end of the corridor. A crazy-looking staircase led up into the darkness. We went cautiously up, I first with a candle, then George, and last of all the butler with a lantern. At the top we stepped into a big, rather low room, with beams across the ceiling, and a rough, uneven floor. Our lights threw strange shadows into the corners, and more than once I stared at what looked like a crouching human figure. We searched every corner. There was nothing to be seen but a few old boxes, a roll or two of matting, and some broken chairs. But in the far corner George pointed out to me a rickety ladder which ended in a closed trap door. Just then I distinctly heard the curious half-groaning, half-sighing sound which had already puzzled me in the corridor below. We stood still and looked at one another. We all heard the sound. "Whatever it is, it's up there," I said. "The question is, who's going up?" George put his candle down upon the floor and stepped upon the ladder. It cracked beneath his weight. He stopped. "Come down. It won't bear you," I said. "I shall have to go." I don't know that I was ever in such a queer funk as I was while I slowly mounted that ladder, and pushed open the trap door. I had formed no clear idea of what I expected to find there. Certainly I was not prepared for what happened, for no sooner was the trap door fully open than there literally fell, upon me from the darkness above, a thing in human shape, which kicked and spat and tore at me as I stood clinging to the ladder. It lasted but a moment or so, but in that moment I lived a lifetime of terror. The ladder swayed and cracked beneath me, and I fell to the floor with the thing gripping my throat like a vice. The next instant George had stunned it with a blow from the poker and dragged it off me. It lay upon its back on the floor, a ragged, hideous, loathsome shape. And the mystery was solved. "But you haven't told us what it really was," said one of the listeners. The doctor smiled. "It was the owner of the house," he replied. "He had not gone abroad. He had gone to a private lunatic asylum with homicidal mania upon him. About a fortnight before this he had managed to escape, and having made his way to his former home, had concealed himself with a cunning often shown by lunatics in the loft. I suppose he had found enough to eat in his nightly rambles about the house. The only wonder is he didn't kill someone before he was caught." End of story 12. Story 13 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Ghost of the Count. Not far from the Alameda, in the city of Mexico, there is a great old stone building, in which once lived a very wealthy and wicked Spanish count. The house has about 4 floors and 90 rooms, more or less. The entire 4th floor is rented and occupied by a big American firm, and their bookkeeper, an American girl, has given us the following true account of the ghost that for years haunted the building. The 2nd floor is unoccupied, as no one cares to live there for obvious reasons. And the bottom floor is also unoccupied, save for lumber rooms, empty boxes, and crates and barrels. And last of all is the great patio with its tiled floor, where secretly in the night a duel was fought to the death by the wicked count and a famous Austrian prince, who was one of Maximilian's men. The count was killed. No one knows why the duel was fought. Some say it was because of a beautiful Spanish woman. Some say it was because of a treasure that the two jointly conveyed, and which the count refused to divide with his princely socio. And more people, Mexicans, shrug their shoulders if you ask about it, and say, "Quien sabe?" "I saw a ghost here last night, Miss James," announces our cashier with much éclat and evident pride. So great is the shock that I gasp, and my pen drops, splattering ink on my nice fresh cuffs, and, worse luck, on the ledger page I had just totted up. It is ruined, and I will have to erase it, or something. Wretched man! "I wish to goodness it had taken you off," I cry, wrathfully, and I look at the bespattered work. "Now will you just look here and see what you have done? I wish you and your ghosts were in Gehenna," he inquires, sweetly. "I'll fix that. It won't take half a minute. And don't look so stern, else I won't tell you about the espanto, and you will be sorry if you don't hear about it. It would make such a good story." "Then go ahead with it." Well, last night I was waiting for West. He was to meet me here, after which it was our intention to hit that is, we were going out together. I nod scornfully. And it seems that while I was patiently waiting here, in my usual sweet-tempered way, the blank idiot had his supper and then lay down to rest himself for a while. You know how delicate he is. Another contemptuous nod. Unfortunately, he forgot the engagement and slept on. He says he never awoke until 3 o'clock, and so didn't come, thinking I wouldn't be there. Meantime, I also went to sleep and might have snoozed on until 3 likewise, but for the fact that the ghost woke me. "Well, do go on," I urge. "The ghost woke me, as I said," proceeds the simpleton slowly. "It was passing its cold fingers over my face and moaning. Really, it was most extraordinary. At first I didn't know what it was. Then, as I felt the icy fingers stroking my face and heard blood-curdling groans issuing from the darkness, I knew what it was. And I remembered the story of the prince and his little duel down in the patio, and knew it was the ghost of the prince's victim. By the way, you don't know what a funny sensation it is to have a ghost pat your face, Miss James." "Pat nothing," I retort indignantly. "I wonder you are not ashamed to tell me such fibs. Such a taradiddle. And as for the man that the prince killed downstairs, you know as well as I do that he was taken home to Spain and buried there. Why, then, should he come back here, into our offices, and pat your face?" "Ah, that I can't say," with a supercilious drawl. "I can only account for it by thinking that the ghost has good taste, better than that of some people I know. But honestly, I swear I'm telling you the truth. Cross my heart and hope to die if I'm not. And you don't know how brave I was. I never screamed. In fact, never made a sound. Oh, I was brave." "Then what did you do?" sternly. "I ran. Por Dios, how I ran! You remember with what alacrity we got down the stairs during the November earthquake?" "I remember only too distinctly." "Well, last night's run wasn't a run, in comparison. It was a disappearance, a flight, a sprint. I went down the 4 flights of stairs like a streak of blue lightning, and the ghost flew with me. I heard the pattering of its steps and its groans clean down to the patio door, and I assure you I quite thought I had made such an impression that it was actually going home with me. And the thought made me feel so weak that I felt perforce obliged to take that is, strengthen myself with a cocktail. After which I felt stronger and went home peacefully. But it was an uncanny experience, wasn't it?" "Was it before or after taking that cocktail?" I asked incredulously. "And did you take one only, or 11? I am hard on the man, but he really deserves it. Ghosts, spirits, perhaps, but not ghosts, whereat his feelings are quite hurted, so much so that he vows he will never tell me anything again. I had better read about Doubting Thomas. He never has seen such an unbelieving woman in all his life, and if I were only a man he would be tempted to pray that I might see the ghost. It would serve me right. Then wrathfully departs, to notice me no more that day. Not believing the least bit in ghosts, I gave the matter no more thought. In fact, when you fell heir to a set of books that haven't been posted for 19 days, and you have to do it all, and get up your trial balance too, or else give up your Christmas holidays, you haven't much time to think about ghosts or anything else, except entries. And though I had been working 14 hours per day, the 24th of December, noon hour, found me with a difference of $13.89, the which I, of course, must locate and straighten out before departing next morning on my week's holiday. Por supuesto, it meant night work. Nothing else would do, and besides, our plans had all been made to leave on the 8 o'clock train next morning. So I would just sit up all night, if need be, and find the wretched balance and be done with it. Behold me settled for work that night at 7 o'clock in my own office, with 3 lamps burning to keep it from looking dismal and lonely, and books and ledgers and journals piled up 2 feet high around me. If hard work would locate that nasty, hateful $13.89, it would surely be found. I had told the portero downstairs on the ground floor to try and keep me awake for a time, but if I didn't soon finish the work I would come down and call him when I was ready to go home. He lived in a little room, all shut off from the rest of the building, so that it was rather difficult to get at him. Besides, he was the very laziest and sleepiest peon possible, and though he was supposed to take care of the building at night, patrolling it so as to keep off the ladrones, he in reality slept so soundly that the last trumpet, much less Mexican robbers, would not have aroused him. And for this very reason, before settling to my work I was careful to go round and look to locks and bolts myself. Everything was secure, and the doors safely fastened, so that if ladrones did break through they would have to be in shape to pass through keyholes or possess false keys. With never a thought of spirits or poteros, or anything else, beyond the $13.89, I worked and added and re-added and footed up. And at 11 o'clock, gracias a Dios, I had the $13 all safe, and would have whooped for joy, had I the time. However, I wasn't out of the woods yet, the sum of $89 being often more easy of location than 89 cents. The latter must be found also, before I could have the pleasure of shouting in celebration thereof. At it I went again. After brain cudgelling and more adding and prayerful thought, I at last had under my thumb that abominable 80 cents. Eureka! Only 9 cents out. I could get it all straight and have some sleep, after all. Inspired by which thought I smothered my yawns, and again began to add. I looked at my watch, 10 minutes to 12. Perhaps I could get it fixed before 1. I suppose I had worked at the 9 cents for about 20 minutes. One of the cash entries looked to me to be in error. I compared it with the voucher. Yes, that was just where the trouble lay. 11 cents, 10, 9. Sst! Out went the lights in the twinkling of an eye, as I sat, gaping in my astonishment. Out from the pitchy darkness of the room came the most dreary, horrible, blood-curdling groan imaginable. As I sat paralyzed, not daring to breathe, doubting my senses for a moment, and then thinking indignantly that it was some trick of that wretched cashier, I felt long, thin, icy fingers passing gently over my face. Malgame Dios, what a sensation! At first I was afraid to move. Then I nervously tried to brush the icy, bony things away. As fast as I brushed, with my heart beating like a steam hammer, and gasping with deadly fear, the fingers would come back again. A cold wind was blowing over me. Again came that dreadful groan, and too frightened to move or scream, I tumbled in a heap on the floor, among the books and ledgers. Then I suppose I fainted. When I regained my senses I was still in a heap with the ledgers, It was still dark, and I still felt the cold fingers caressing my face. At which I became thoroughly desperate. No ghost should own me. I had laughed at the poor cashier, and hinted darkly at cocktails. Pray, what better was I? I scrambled to my feet, the fingers still stroking my face. I must address them. What language did they understand, English or Spanish, I wondered. Spanish would doubtless be most suitable, if indeed it was the ghost of the murdered Count. "Will you do me the favor, Señor Ghost," I started out bravely, in my best Spanish, but with a very trembling voice, "to inform me what it is you desire? Is there anything I can do for you? Because, if not, I would like very much to be allowed to finish my work, which I cannot do, if you will pardon my abruptness, if I am not alone." Being the ghost of a gentleman and a diplomat, surely he would take the hint and vanish. Ojalá! Perhaps the ghost did not understand my Spanish. At any rate, there was no articulate reply. There was another groan. Again the fingers touched me, and then there was such a mournful sigh that I felt sorry for the poor thing. What could be the matter with it? With my pity, all fear was lost for a moment, and I said to the darkness all about me, "What is it that you wish, pobre señor? Can I not aid you? I am not afraid. Let me help you." The fingers moved uncertainly for a moment. Then the ledgers all fell down, with a loud bang. A cold hand caught mine, very gently. I tried not to feel frightened, but it was difficult, and I was led off blindly through the offices. I could not see a thing, not a glimmer of light showed, not a sound was heard except my own footsteps, and the faint sound of the invisible something that was leading me along. There were no more groans, thank goodness, else I should have shrieked and fainted, without a doubt. Only the pattering footsteps and the cold hand that led me on and on. We, the fingers and I, were somehow in the great hall, then on the second floor, and at last on the stairs, going down flight after flight. I knew that I was being led about by the fingers on the tiled floor of the patio, and close to the potero's lodge. Simpleton that he was, sleeping like a log no doubt, while I was being led about in the black darkness by an invisible hand, and no one to save me. I would have yelled, of course, but for one fact. I found it utterly impossible to speak or move my tongue, being a rare and uncomfortable sensation. But where were we going? Back into the unused lumber rooms, joining into the patio? Nothing there, except barrels and slabs and empty boxes. What could the ghost mean? He must be utterly demented, surely. In the middle of the first room we paused. I had an idea of rushing out and screaming for the potero, but abandoned it when I found that my feet wouldn't go. I heard steps passing to and fro about the floor, and waited, cold and trembling. They approached me. Again my hand was taken, and I was led over near the corner of the room. Obedient to the unseen will, I bent down and groped about the floor, guided by the cold fingers holding mine, until I felt something like a tiny ring, set firmly in the floor. I pulled at it faintly, but it did not move, at which the ghost gave a faint sigh. For a second the cold fingers pressed mine, quite affectionately, then released me, and I heard steps passing slowly into the patio, then dying away. Where was it going, and what on earth did it all mean? But I was so tired and wrought up, I tried to find the door, but couldn't. The cashier would have been revenged could he have seen me stupidly fumbling at a barrel thinking it was the door. And at last, too fatigued and sleepy to stand, I dropped down on the cold stone floor and went to sleep. I must have slept for some hours, for when I awoke the light of dawn was coming in at the window, and I sat up and wondered if I had taken leave of my senses during the night. What on earth could I be doing here in the lumber room? Then, like a flash, I remembered, and half unconsciously crept about on the floor, seeking the small ring. There it was. I caught it and jerked at it hard. Hey, presto change! For it seemed to me that the entire floor was giving way. There was a sliding, crashing sound, and I found myself hanging on for dear life to a barrel that, fortunately, retained its equilibrium, and with my feet dangling into space. Down below me was a small, stone-floored room, with big boxes and small ones ranged about the walls. Treasure! Like a flash the thought struck me, and with one leap I was down in the secret room gazing about at the boxes. But alas! Upon investigation, the biggest chests proved empty. The bad, wicked Count! No wonder he couldn't rest in his Spanish grave, but must come back to the scene of his wickedness and deceit to make reparation. But the smaller chests were literally crammed with all sorts of things. Big heavy Spanish coins, in gold and silver dinner services, with the crest of the unfortunate emperor, magnificent pieces of jeweled armor and weapons, beautiful jewelry and loose precious stones. I deliberately selected handfuls of the latter, giving my preference to the diamonds and pearls. I had always had a taste for them, which I had never been before able to gratify, and packed them in a wooden box that I found in the lumber room. The gold and dinner services and armor, etc., I left as they were, being rather cumbersome, and carried off, rejoicing, my big box of diamonds and pearls and other jewelry. Needless to say, we didn't go away for the holidays on the 8 o'clock train. But I did come down to the office and proceed to locate my missing 9 cents. After which I unfolded the tale of the ghost and treasure, only keeping quiet the matter of my private loot, of which I was heartily glad afterwards. For when the government learned of the find, what do you suppose they offered me for going about with the ghost and discovering that secret room and treasure? $10,000! When I refused, stating that I would take merely as my reward one of the gold dinner services, the greedy things objected at first, but I finally had my way. And to this very day they have no idea that even I, have all the beautiful jewels. Wouldn't they be furious if they knew it? But they aren't apt to, unless they learn English and read this story, which isn't likely. End of story 13. Story 14 of 30 Ghost Stories by various authors. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. The Old Mansion. Down on Long Beach, that narrow strip of sand which stretches along the New Jersey coast from Barnegat Inlet to the north to Little Egg Harbor Inlet on the south, the summer sojourner at some one of the numerous resorts, which of late years have sprung up every few miles, may, in wandering over the sand dunes just across the bay from the village of Manahawkin, stumble over some charred timbers or vestiges of crumbling chimneys, showing that once, years back, a human habitation has stood there. If the find rouses the jaded curiosity of the visitor sufficiently to impel him to question the weather-beaten old bayman who sails him on his fishing trips, he will learn that these relics mark the site of one of the first summer hotels erected on the New Jersey coast. That's where the old mansion stood, he will be informed by Captain Nate or Captain Sam, or whatever particular captain it may chance to be, and if by good fortune it chances to be Captain Jim, he will hear a story that will pleasantly pass away the long wait for a sheep's head bite. It was my good luck to have secured Captain Jim for a preceptor in the angler's art during my vacation last summer, and his stories and reminiscences of Long Beach were not the least enjoyable features of the 2 weeks' sojourn. Captain Jim was not garrulous. Few of the baymen are. They are a sturdy, self-reliant, and self-controlled people, full of strong common sense, but still within that firm belief in the supernatural which seems inherent in the dwellers by the sea. The old mansion, said Captain Jim, or the Mansion of Health, for that was its full name, was built way back in 1822, so I've heard my father say. There had been a tavern close by years before that was kept by a man named Kramer, and people used to come from Philadelphia by stage, 60 miles through the pines, to Hawken, and then cross here by boat. Some would stop at Kramer's, and others went down to the beach to Homer's, which was clear down at the end of the inlet. Finally, some of the wealthy people concluded that they wanted better accommodations than Kramer gave, so they formed the Great Swamp Long Beach Company, and built the Mansion of Health. I've heard that when it was built it was the biggest hotel on the coast, and was considered a wonder. It was 120 feet long, 3 stories high, and had a porch running all the way around it, with a balcony on top. It was certainly a big thing for those days. I've heard Father tell many a time of the stage loads of gay people that used to come rattling into Hawken, each stage drawn by 4 horses, and sometimes 4 or 5 of them a day in the summer. A good many people, too, used to come in their own carriages, and leave them over on the mainland until they were ready to go home. There were gay times at the old mansion then, and it made good times for the people along the shore, too. "How long did the old mansion flourish, Captain?" I asked. "Well, for 25 or 30 years people came there summer after summer. Then they built a railroad to Cape May, and that, with the ghosts, settled the Mansion of Health." "What do you mean by the ghosts?" I demanded. "Well, you see," said Captain Jim, cutting off a mouthful of navy plug, "the story got around that the old house was haunted. Some people said there were queer things seen there, and strange noises were heard that nobody could account for. And pretty soon the place got a bad name, and visitors were so few that it didn't pay to keep it open any more." "But how did it get the name of being haunted, Captain Jim?" I persisted. "Why, it was this way," continued the mariner. "Maybe you've heard of the time early in the 50's, when the Powhatan was wrecked on the beach here, and every soul on board was lost. She was an emigrant ship, and there were over 400 people aboard, passengers and crew. She came ashore here during the equinoctial storm in September. There wasn't any life-saving stations in them days, and everyone was drowned. You can see the long graves now over in the Hawken churchyard, where the bodies were buried after they came ashore. They put them in 3 long trenches that were dug from one end of the burying ground to the other. The only people on the beach that night was the man who took care of the old mansion. He lived there with his family, and his son-in-law lived with him. He was the wreck master for this part of the coast, too. It wasn't till the second day that people from Hawken could get over to the beach, and by that time the bodies all had come ashore, and the wreck master had them all piled up on the sand. I was a youngster then, and came over with my father, and I tell you, it was the awfullest sight I ever saw. Them long rows of drowned people, all lying there with their white, still faces turned up to the sky. Some were women with their dead babies clasped tight in their arms, and some were husbands and wives, whose bodies came ashore locked together in a death embrace. I'll never forget that sight as long as I live. Well, when the coroner came and took charge, he began to inquire whether any money or valuables had been found, but the wreck master declared that not a solitary coin had been washed ashore. People thought this was rather singular, as the immigrants were, most of them, well-to-do Germans, and were known to have brought a good deal of money with them, but it was concluded that it had gone down with the ship. Well, the poor immigrants were given pauper burial, and the people had begun to forget their suspicions until 3 or 4 months later there came another storm, and the sea broke clear over the beach, just below the old mansion, and washed away the sand. Next morning early 2 men from Hawken sailed across the bay and landed on the beach. They walked across on the hard bottom where the sea had washed across, and, when about halfway from the bay, one of the men saw something curious close up against the stump of an old cedar tree. He called the other man's attention to it, and they went over to the stump. What they found was a pile of leather money belts that would have filled a wheelbarrow. Every one was cut open and empty. They had been buried in the sound close by the old stump, and the sea had washed away the covering. The men didn't go any further. They carried the belts to their boats and sailed back to Hawken as fast as the wind would take them. Of course, it made a big sensation, and everybody was satisfied that the wreckmaster had robbed the bodies, if he hadn't done anything worse, but there was no way to prove it, and so nothing was done. The wreckmaster didn't stay around here long after that, though. The people made it too hot for him, and he and his family went away south, where it was said he bought a big plantation and a lot of slaves. Years afterward the story came to Hawkins somehow that he was killed in a barroom brawl, and that his son-in-law was drowned by his boat upsettin' while he was out fishin'. I don't furnish any affidavits with that part of the story, though. However, after that nobody lived in the old mansion for long at a time. People would go there, stay a week or two, and leave. And at last it was given up entirely to beach parties in the daytime and ghosts at night. "But, Captain, you don't really believe the ghost part, do you?" I asked. Captain Jim looked down the bay, expectorated gravely over the side of the boat, and answered slowly, "Well, I don't know as I would have believed in 'em if I hadn't seen the ghost." "What?" I exclaimed. "You saw it? Tell me about it. I've always wanted to see a ghost, or next best thing, a man who has seen one." "It was one August about 1861, said the captain. "I was a young feller then, and with a half-dozen more was over on the beach cutting salt hay. We didn't go home at nights, but did our own cooking in the old mansion kitchen, and at night slept on the piles of hay upstairs. We were a reckless lot of scamps, and reckoned that no ghosts could scare us. There was a big full moon that night, and it was as light as day. The muskeeters was pretty bad too, and it was easier to stay awake than go to sleep. Along toward midnight me and two other fellers went out on the old balcony, and began to race around the house. We hollered and yelled, and chased each other for half an hour or so, and then we concluded we'd better go to sleep. So we started for the window of the room where the rest were. This window was near one end on the ocean side, and as I came around the corner, I stopped as if I'd been shot, and my hair raised straight up on the top of my head. Right there in front of that window stood a woman looking out over the sea, and in her arms she held a little child. I saw her as plain as I see you now. It seemed to me like an hour she stood there, but I don't suppose it was a second, then she was gone. When I could move I looked around for the other boys, and they were standing there paralyzed. They had seen the woman too. They didn't say much, and we didn't sleep much that night, and the next night we bunked out on the beach. The rest of the crowd made all manner of fun of us, but we had had all the ghosts we wanted, and I never set foot inside that old house after that." "When did it burn down, Captain?" I asked, as Jim relapsed into silence. "Somewhere about 25 years ago. A beach party had been roasting clams in the old oven, and in some way the fire got to the woodwork. It was as dry as tinder, and I hope the ghosts were all burned up with it." End of story 14.
Alright guys, that's it for this episode. One more episode and we will have it finished. Thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed. Don't forget to comment, like, and subscribe. And remember, you are beautiful. You are amazing. Keep being you. And have a good night.